But for now, please join me in welcoming in dialogue Michael Sandel and John Ralston Saul.
No, you go ahead.
Okay.
Well, I'll start. I was there for Michael's session yesterday. I thought it was fabulous. And for those who are Platonists and don't believe in public dialogue, but believe in top-down, it was a fabulous illustration of how the Socratic school is alive and well, and the humanist school is alive and well. And I thought the questions, you were great. You had to hold that all in your head. But I thought the questions were, and the statements and the arguments were really interesting. So well, you must have been exhausted at the end.
It was energizing. The audience really rose to the occasion. They were the participants. They advanced the arguments and kind of worked out the principles. So I find it exhilarating to do that, and it's really it's a way of experimenting with the possibilities of public reason in a way. And I think, and this is a theme that I think runs through both of our works.
We're worrying about agreeing too much.
But I have a hunch that if we agree too much, the audience
will do something.
Will provide a good corrective. But the idea of public reason as an alternative to technocratic, managerial public discourse, I think is a shared concern that runs through our works in various ways. And so what we thought we would do really, we're meeting here, two North Americans for the first time in Jaipur. So we thought we would explore some of the themes, some overlapping themes, some with different emphases in our works related to questions of globalization, markets, morals, ethics, justice, and also reason, the dictatorship of reason. So maybe we'll explore some of those themes between the two of us for a time, and then invite the audience into the discussion.
Absolutely.
Since we began with reason, dialectic or dialogical reason, the deliberation that takes place when people gather to try to reason together about big questions and manage to listen to one another, which is what so struck me yesterday. Maybe I can put to you, John, a question about reason. The dictatorship of reason. The book is now celebrating its 25th anniversary. 20th anniversary.
Voltaire's Bastards.
And reason with a capital R, especially when it's connected to reason in the West, sometimes has a bad name. And maybe you could begin by taking us back a little bit to when you wrote that book 20 years ago. Reason seems a worthy aspiration, something we want more of, not less of. So could you begin by describing a little bit what you saw then and maybe see now as the dictatorship of reason?
Yeah, I think it's worth, just as a follow-on to what we said before, which is when I finished this book, which, I stopped writing novels and then sat down and went and fill a hole with thousands of people. Why? Because people want to be part of a conversation. And it's not a rational conversation as we have understood it. without using as an equal weight things like ethics or imagination or memory or intuition, then it becomes an ideology. And once it becomes an ideology, it eats itself. And really what the 20th century was the culmination of rationality eating itself as Europe, the home of modern Western rationality, engaged in a civil war in which about 100 million people were killed by Europeans with a little help from you and us Canadians and the Indians and all the colonials. We all came in to help them kill each other. But it was, and yet nobody would stand back and say, wait a minute, to what extent is rationality responsible for the Holocaust? They wouldn't have that discussion. So that book was an attempt to say, look, you can organize and do healthcare with rationality, you can do the Holocaust with rationality, so what are we missing? You know?
Right, yeah.
And so that boils down 1,000 pages where I talk about the rise of celebrity, which, interesting enough, in the early 90s, celebrity was much less present. It was really growing like this. Today in India, you all know the effects of celebrity in public life. And we know it in Europe, we know it in the Americas. But in the 90s, it wasn't yet clear what the effect, the destructive effects of celebrity in public life. And that actually came out as a reaction to rational methodology. And how do you cover it up with a sort of fun surface, a heroic, distracting surface?
Right.
You know.
So the kind of rationality that you're against is what I would take to be, tell me if I have this right, what might be called instrumental rationality, technocratic, managerial rationality, or more broadly a kind of disembodied rationality, disembodied from moral sources, imaginative sources, memory you mentioned. Would you be unsympathetic to the proposal or the suggestion that that to reject this narrow kind of instrumental technocratic rationality and the tyranny that it can exercise, it's not necessary to toss out the idea of reason altogether, but to reclaim it for a kind of situated or embodied reason, a kind of reason that is embodied in and grows out of narratives, deliberation, memory, ethical reflection. The reason I'm asking you this is I wouldn't want to concede altogether to technocracy, the banner of reason. I would like to retain the possibility that we can reason together in a small r, reason together about justice, the common good, the nature of the good life, what it is to be a human being, what obligations we owe to one another. And my worry is that if we say none of that's to do with reason, because we want to distance ourselves from this purely disembodied idea of reason, that it will be landed with a way of thinking about morality and ethics and politics that says, well, look, we're never going to disagree, therefore there's no point in trying to reason together about justice and the good life. I don't think we want, and I don't think you want to suggest that either. So what about my proposal?
I'm in total agreement. I mean,
it's all right?
Unfortunately, I mean,
okay.
it's. I mean, what I'm saying is, where I guess I differ from what's the kind of university interpretation, which I know is not yours, that's a compliment, is that I think that the rise of instrumental reason comes entirely out of the worship of reason as a standalone top position. That, in other words, rationality in the more noble sense stands above ethics, memory,
right,
imagination, and that's right, the sort of Platonist thing. And that it's that decision to put ethics in the driver's, reason in the driver's seat, which meant that reason would dribble down into instrumental reason in utilitarianism and so on.
Right.
And that they would then get control of it. So you would be out there doing great work, I would be doing what I can do. But in fact, when one looks at the power structures and the use of, or the not use of morality and ethics, it's largely because one left reason all alone up there.
Right.
And so my argument is that you really need to think of things like ethics, things like imagination as partners. And if reason is partnered by these other things, you will not end up in instrumental reason.
Yeah.
So I almost don't believe in instrumental reason because I think it's the outcome of an ideology of reason.
Right.
And it prevents us from using reason as you and the public were using it yesterday. I mean, it is conscious use of our intelligence to reason together. But I mean, the real question, you know, you quite rightly keep asking questions about morality and ethics. So my question back to you is, I feel that the dribble down effect of rationality as God into instrumental reason has led us into an era of amorality and the shoving of ethics off into the corner. And even though we are all interested in it, we can't get decisions made or debates organized for decisions to be made on any public issue where ethics is put in the center. It's always, well, once we've worked out how to get people jobs, or once we've worked out how to organize this, then we'll talk about ethics when we have time, when we have the money, as if it were a sort of small pleasure for people in power, as opposed to as important as reason itself. So, I mean, how do you when you talk about morality and ethics all the time, and how do you see its relationship to what's happened to the use of reason?
Well, I've tried to lean against the tendency to see reason as detached from community, history, memory, and public deliberation. And I think one of the culprits in this detached idea of reason and the technocratic conception of reason is economics, and even some economists. And I think economics has become a kind of imperial discipline. As recently as 40 years ago, 50 years ago, if you opened up an economics textbook, the subject matter of economics was understood as trade, investment, inflation, unemployment, how to achieve economic growth, banking, capital markets, that kind of thing, economic topics. But today, and really over the last 3 decades, economics has conceived itself not just as the study of the buying and selling of and the production of goods, but as a science of human behavior itself. So the ambition of economics has grown to become a kind of imperial discipline that can explain everything, not just the balance of trade and debt and so on, but whether to get married, when to get married, whether to have children, how many children to have, whether to stay married or to get divorced. Beginning in the 1970s.
Early 70s, yeah.
And you've also written about this beginning in the 70s and then into the 80s. This has, economics has presented itself as a science of everything, really. And I think this is, and in the process of claiming to be a science, it's claimed to be a value-neutral science. And so economics has become detached from moral and political philosophy. We go back to the classical economists, from Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx. Despite their different political views and ideological views, they shared the idea, the assumption that economics is not an autonomous subject, but a subfield, a branch of moral and political philosophy.
Absolutely.
And today, it's very different. And so part of the rethinking of the role of reason, but also of the way we should think about economic questions, I think, requires that we question that idea of economics as a value-neutral science and reconnect economics with the older tradition of moral and political economy, as it was called.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I was speaking to a gathering of the heads of business schools around the world, American, Canadian, Asian, and so on. And I said a few things, and afterwards a number of them came up to me and said, you know, Adam Smith said this, and Adam Smith said that. And it was the classic. There are about 3 quotes from Adam Smith that they use. They're quite short, you know, the invisible hand and stuff. These are the heads of major business schools. And I was standing there with another guy who would more or less agree with us, and I said, you know, that's not what Adam Smith said. Adam Smith wrote, you know, Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is a book about empathy, about civilization, and his economics book was a footnote to his major book. His tombstone is very clear. It says, you know, Adam Smith, author of The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and, in smaller letters, The Wealth of Nations. It's a footnote. And, you know, the book is filled with attacks on the tendency of businessmen, if not properly regulated, to not pay taxes, to fix the market. Absolutely a sort of center-left interpretation of how society works, including some sort of free market. But the reason I tell this story is because when I said this to him, he said, well, we don't read Adam Smith. We just read extracts from Adam Smith. And if you go to economics departments, which are indeed the senior department in universities around the world today, including here, I think, he said, oh, well, historians read that. We don't read that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's relegated to the history of ideas.
Yeah. And then you come to the really interesting thing, which was from the 70s on, there was a sort of intellectual cleansing in the departments of economics to remove the historians of economics. So there would be no memory of what economics was really about. It would all be about statistics and value neutral, and that would lead you into this sort of, you want to do a cultural festival? Well, let's look at the numbers. As opposed to what is the role in society? Well, there isn't really a society. We're going to look at self-interest here. So as you know from this book, The Collapse of Globalism, my theory is that in the 70s, and I think it's your theory, we had a crisis. A small school of economists with a very marginal idea of what economics is jumped into the vacuum, in a sense took over because the Keynesians failed, and then saddled us with something called globalization, which is not internationalism. There are many schools of internationalism. Witness the fact that you could have that conversation yesterday here in India. That sounds like internationalism to me, you know, but globalism is a specific school of how to run the world through economics. To judge everything through economics, as you would say, you know, selling off every brick in a building to people put their names on it, everything being given a financial value as opposed to an ethical value or a societal value.
Now, here's a question we both, I think, have to be able to answer. Here we've been criticizing economists and economics, and we've been in full agreement and patting one another on the back about it. But suppose someone said to us, listening to this conversation, aren't we attributing too much independent power and influence to what academics and economists say and write? Don't we need to give an account, and of course you've written a book on the subject, don't we need to give an account about what it is about the world that we live in and have lived in for the past 3 decades that has been hospitable to this kind of turn in the academy? What is it about the world in which we live that has given persuasive currency to the theory of market-driven globalization that we've criticized? Why does it seem almost a statement of the obvious when we here are sitting taking pot shots at that way of thinking?
But don't you think that if you look at the rise of the technocracy, you know, some people say bureaucracies in government, the bureaucracies in the big private sector are just as big, and actually even more problematic, frankly, when one's dealing with how to control them. You look at that rise of the technocracy, there's a wonderful thing, an analysis of when did the British Empire start to fall. I'm trying to remember his name. He was the the head of the civil service and a big expert on the military. And it was something like 1895 when there were more naval officers in the Admiralty in London than there were on ships. Right? So they weren't actually serving the Navy, they were serving themselves. So this rise of the technocracy and the methodology of method over content, over delivery, gets bigger and bigger. And then you get into the 70s, and frankly, I think that those people were looking for a Bible. They were looking for something that gave them, that made them seem noble. It's like you conquer a throne with the sword and you cut off people's heads, and then you look around and how can I make it seem as if I'm supposed to be here? God wanted me to be here. Destiny wanted me to be here. And this is what they found, this argument of globalism, of economics, of utilitarianism, of deliverabilities, of trade, and so on. And they hooked themselves onto that, of course, right, and rode with it.
They meaning the technocrats who were in power.
Who were in power, and increasingly, I think, politicians who came to power with either from the technocracy or with the blessing of the technocracy, a kind of confusing of the two, which later on leads to the rise of populism as a reaction against it. But what we've been living is ministers and prime ministers and presidents who hardly move without the approval of the technocracy, the approval of will it work economically. And frankly, if you look at the reaction to, say, the mortgage crisis in the West, you can see that these people were unable to move. That they actually decided they would save banks and not people.
The political figures.
The political figures, pushed by the technocracy, who said, "Oh, sir, you must do that. You must save the banks."
Yeah.
Whereas they could have actually, they could have just said, every mortgage up to $300,000 we will pay off as of next Monday, or rip it up. Anything over that you still owe. And at that point, you've solidified the working class and the lower middle class as householders. You've got them out of debt. They can start spending again, and you've saved the banks worth saving. But they couldn't do that. They had to save the banks, which was the kind of logic which came out of this methodology. So, I mean, there are lots of other ways of doing things, I guess. And I think when I listen to you and read you, what I hear is there are lots of other ways of doing things. We don't have to do it that way.
Right, right.
Right,
so here's maybe this. I find this very interesting, and I'm trying to glimpse what may be not a difference of view, but of emphasis maybe. Of course, there are these established political parties and politicians who are indebted to financial supporters who pushed this response to the financial crisis. Agreed. I have a hunch, though, that there is a resonance to market thinking and market reasoning and economistic ways of looking at the world that runs deeper and that explains the staying power of a marketized view of the world even after the financial crisis
even after failure.
Showed its failure.
Yeah.
And for me, it's a puzzle that people like us have to be able to give a convincing answer to. Why? Because here, John was writing a book about globalism in 2005, right? Pointing out all of the vulnerabilities of this system. And then came the financial crisis, which cast you as a kind of prophet. But here's what I want to observe. When the financial crisis came, those of us who were skeptics of a market-driven vision of globalization probably all expected, now at last will come a more robust debate than we've had before, because the financial system has come right to the edge of collapse. The market faith, the market triumphalist faith that has been an unquestioned assumption of public discourse for roughly 3 decades, now will surely come into question. And now we will have the debate that's been missing all these years about what should be the role of money and markets in a good society. We expected that.
Absolutely.
And so given that expectation, we have to be able to explain why that debate hasn't really happened. And I have one explanation. And let me
I want to hear it.
You want to, I think that the faith in markets and in economistic ways of organizing social life have some powerful sources of appeal in our self-understandings, beyond the power of technocrats and politicians indebted to banks and Wall Street and so on, that we have to take seriously if we're trying to reconstruct a kind of public discourse and a civic energy as a set of alternatives. Part of the appeal is the standard appeal that people believe markets deliver the goods, rising affluence and prosperity and GDP. And it is true that market economies have produced rising prosperity, not widely distributed, in many countries around the world. But that's a limited part of the appeal. I think the deeper part of the appeal is that the market faith draws upon a certain idea of freedom. Now, I think it's a spurious idea of freedom, but it does have a powerful resonance and allure. And the idea is this: market relations, making deals, spare us from the need to come to a collective decision on controversial questions about how to value goods. Because the picture of a market transaction is of a consensual, voluntary exchange between two people, each of whom places whatever value he or she wants on the goods being exchanged. So if it's a contract for surrogate motherhood, paid pregnancy, the parties themselves decide whether it's worth it for, let's say, for a woman to accept $7,000 or $10,000 or $20,000 to carry a child, let's say for a wealthy couple who wants to hire her. The society as a whole, we as citizens don't have to enter into messy, controversial, ethical debates about whether that's the right way to value one's body or procreative capability. Or if one person wants to buy a kidney and another wants to sell a kidney, they decide on the value of their body, of the organ, and they make a deal. And the rest of us, we can have our opinions on the sidelines, but we don't have to debate in public, collectively. Is that the right way of valuing the human body? And so I think this idea that markets provide us a value-neutral way of avoiding messy public debates about contested ethical questions is a big part of the appeal of market reasoning. It goes along with the idea that we shy away in democratic societies from debating questions about the good life and about virtue and about justice in public, because in pluralist societies we know we are going to disagree. And sometimes those disagreements will be informed by competing moral traditions or religious and spiritual traditions. So we say, can't we find a way to ask citizens, democratic citizens, to leave their moral and spiritual convictions at the door when they enter the public square? And so the idea of a market transaction and of a market society seems to provide that neutral, non-judgmental way. It's a way of outsourcing or privatizing moral judgment. And I think that's a deeply seated habit of mind when we think about politics. And it's understandable in pluralist societies where we disagree about these contested ethical questions. And I think we're not going to break the hold and the grip of market reasoning on public discourse until we shed ourselves of that habit of trying to stand back from hard ethical debate in public life. What about that?
No, I mean, it's clear that people have become very nervous about public debate, and part of that, frankly, is because when we say technocratic, it's far bigger than technocrats. It's the technocratization of everybody. Is a technocrat of a small part of medicine and doesn't, you know, you see how when somebody's sick in your family, you find the doctors won't talk together in front of you. They go and talk separately because they actually don't know how to talk to each other because they're in these separate pods, these little things, and they have separate languages and they have to negotiate with each other on a kind of utilitarian basis of how the heart relates to what your legs and what. It's a very funny thing if you're not dying. I mean, to see them struggling with how to talk to each other. And the whole of society has, and of course we're happy to have them knowing about our heart and our leg, but this inability to have the conversation about something so basic means it will be very difficult to have the ethical conversations about life, the good life, and so on. So there's an enormous nervousness, about, as soon as you're hired, you go to university, in public universities, for example, say Canada's all public universities. You go to universities, but even private universities, and in a sense, what you get at university is how to be a citizen. You go, you get your job, and written or unwritten in the contract is that everything you know, everything you're an expert in, actually belongs to the person who has hired you. You can only speak in public if you are saying what they want to say. So they actually buy the ethical and moral content of your knowledge. So an expert in nuclear weapons or nuclear energy can't stand up and say in public what they think because they work for somebody and they have to say what the corporation says. So that's a major, that idea of the whistleblower, the problem of the whistleblower comes out of the fact that we've set up society, a corporatist, technocratic society of specialists who are not able to speak in public. So we fall back on something like what you've described. I think the other element is, it's cyclical to some extent. You know, France in the 1830s and 40s, Louis Philippe, everything was about money. It was all about money, and everything was worship was about money. And then you go into another kind of period. So we've had this 30-year period of let's do it through self-interest, which is the market. We all know we need the market. The question is, to what extent is it balanced with a whole bunch of other things like public interest and ethics? But my last comment is that the economists do not sit alone in the universities. The business schools have become, if you like, the infantry forces of this little pod of economists. So the business schools and the economic schools fit together. They filled the civil services, they filled the management of the big corporations. This is the way people think and speak. So in the 17th century, every sentence would have, when you were making an argument, you would have said, in Christian world, you would have said, by the grace of God, periodically, you know? And now you bring out something, as Adam Smith said, even though you haven't read him. And so it's a new sort of religious form of discussion. And so when a prime minister or a head of a corporation wants advice, it comes down through these people who agree, because they're all trained in the same way, and they've got the backup of their philosophers who are the economists. You know, so, and my last tiny comment is, I think we must not underestimate the extent to which a 30-year period, which was supposed to be about increased competition in the market, actually was about a return to the old-fashioned class system. You know, when you look at the way we've structured things, the United States, Canada, I mean, India, we've all gone back into a class system, as seen in the 19th century or the 18th century. The United States has an aristocracy. It hates being told that, but it has an aristocracy. You know, if you have that much money and you keep it 3 generations and you have those privileges, that's called an aristocracy. So once you've got an aristocracy, you're starting to live in the kind of, you know, Versailles problems, you know, go to Davos, it's a kind of funny Versailles for these people to make themselves feel good about themselves. As aristocrats, it's the way the noblesse de la robe, you know, the second-rate aristocrats of France would go to Versailles to preen, really. So we're in an atmosphere where it's very difficult to have a sensible discussion about, hey, you failed. You know, how are we going to change the direction?
I want to raise one other question that people like us need to wrestle with. And it's one that I've not really come to a satisfactory answer to. And it has to do with raising criticisms of market triumphalism or of market-driven visions of globalization in India.
Right.
In my first visit to India was in late 2001. And I spoke to a group at the Confederation of Indian Industry, business leaders for the most part, Indian business leaders. And I gave a talk that was expressing some skepticism about the full-throated version of American-style globalization. Immediately opening all financial markets, free capital flows, open competition, free trade without qualification. And I was trying to suggest that there were some virtues to qualified versions of those policies, but there were also excesses that went with it, and that India should not feel driven by this American-style view of globalization. The commentator was an Indian economist and now a politician, about my age, very articulate and passionate and outspoken. He's now actually a minister in the government, a member of the Congress Party. You can try to speculate. And at that
We're getting there. We're trying to figure it out.
At that time, he got up and said, "This is a disaster what you're coming. You're coming from Harvard to give us this nuanced view, this qualified view about markets and globalization. But what we need here, we need the force of, we can't have all those nuances. We need market reforms in order to get rid of the heavy hand of the state and the unaccountable bureaucracy and the corruption. And if you come here giving this ambivalent message about market reforms and free trade and opening capital markets, that may be fine, you know, for a Harvard seminar, but you're going to lead us astray in India with that kind of talk." This is what he said. And he proceeded to give the kind of unbridled, laissez-faire, free market view that made me think that instead of, that when I came to New Delhi, I was actually wandering by mistake into the University of Chicago Economics Department. Now maybe you can guess who my interlocutor was. Well, and now he's actually revised his views, I think, somewhat. And one other example, but see, all right, here I'm inviting us to be kind of critically aware of this, and maybe the audience can respond. When I wrote this book, What Money Can't Buy, on the moral limits of markets, I was critical of the excess. I took myself to be leaning against the dominant tendencies in my own society, where money and markets govern more and more of life and crowd out non-market values. But in one dialogue, actually coming up day after tomorrow in Mumbai, I have another interlocutor, another Indian interlocutor, not a politician, but a business leader who's already said what his response is going to be. He's apparently also a kind of laissez-faire, pro-market guy. He said, referring to me, quote, "This guy is coming to the right place here in India, where we believe primarily in non-market transactions. So, for example," he says, "people jump queues in airports or in the Tirupati temple, not by paying money. You know, I'm criticized to paid VIP passes in amusement parks and at the airport, and even at Tirupati temple that you can buy to pay more to get to the head of the line." He says, "But here, that's not our problem. Here, people jump the queues at those places, including Tirupati, by virtue of being ministers."
Right.
From the government. And he says, are these non-market transactions any more moral than the market ones that this guy, me, is criticizing? So here's the question. It's for us and also for the audience, because we now want to open the discussion to the audience. Should North American critics of markets like John and me temper our criticism of the drift toward market societies, putting a price tag on everything? In India, if the real problem here is how to enable markets to break down not norms of ethics and memory and values, the kind of thing we're worried about, markets corroding. But here, markets might be a healthy, welcome solvent for the encrusted, heavy hand of bureaucrats and ministerial privilege and corruption and the heavy hand of the state. What about that?
So we'll go to the audience, but just very quickly. I mean, we know that there's this problem in India. The question is, can a kind of rising business aristocracy clean up this problem, or do they simply turn themselves into another gated community and then go out and corrupt the civil service, so the civil service stays exactly as it is, so that the business people can do what they want? And it's, from what I hear, I'm not an expert, it sounds like it's going more in that direction.
Okay, let's see what
and just the one last thing is, it's worth saying that I don't think you should feel guilty about what you were saying, because there is a universal principle of the good prince, the good king, whether you're in a democracy or not. There is an idea that there should be the market, but there should be fairness. It exists. There are lots of people in the history of India who had a belief of what the good prince was and what the good king was. And we know historically that the market totalists have always said they could handle it.
Right.
And we know that there has always been a fight to say there's a role for the markets, but you have to pay taxes, you have to follow rules, there have to be public services, there has to be education. And this festival opened with Professor Sen giving a fabulous speech on this stage where he said, here are 7 things that I want. He was very funny about it. And those 7 things require limits on the market, but a market, and a cleanup of the government, but government. But there are things like education, fair education for everybody, healthcare for everybody, clean water, basic stuff that the market will not provide if left on its own. And
Okay, thanks. So, shall we? Do you want to call on people, or should I? Okay. All right. Yes, the person with the scarf. Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. It's funny that you bring up Professor Sen in one of the last.
A little louder. A little louder.
Am I audible now? Yeah. So it's funny that you brought up Professor Sen, because that was something that I was looking to bring up in due course of time. I think, on a large level, when we look at India, we think of Delhi and Bombay and perhaps the audience here. And you might as well say that maybe we need market features to come into the country. But I doubt whether the country as a whole, when you look at every part of the country and take it as a whole, I doubt if we have that level of social preconditioning. Exactly the points that you were mentioning in the last part of your speech. Free water, free drinking water, clean drinking water, sanitation, accesses. So there's a difference between equality of opportunity and equality of access. And I wonder if the country is prepared or has given its population that equality of access that it requires for us to, seek the kind of equality of opportunity that these free market thinkers talk about in general life.
Yeah, good. Maybe we'll take a few. Or
why don't we take a few? Yeah. That's a great idea.
Okay.
Why don't we try to go right back somewhere?
All right. The woman in the middle. Yes. Go ahead. The woman sitting down. Yes. In the green, orange sweater.
You have good eyesight.
My question is that, sir, how do we bring back morality, ethics in the capitalistic system? Like, is the government the right actor to bring guidelines, maybe for that matter, without taking away the freedom from people, or freedom from the actors, freedom from industrialists, freedom from people? So what will be the right mode of bringing morality and ethics in the system?
Okay, good. Let's take maybe the person way toward the side. Toward the back. Toward the back, sitting on the far side. We'll get a microphone over to the far side.
There we are.
Okay, go ahead.
Professor Sandel, you asked us a question in terms of whether you should, or thinkers like you should temper your criticism. I, on the other hand, feel that you should sharpen your criticism rather than tempering. Because if it was not for the RBI governors, the politician who met you, if they had opened up the markets, India would have gone haywire. One. Secondly, in one of the other sessions, Professor Dipankar Gupta told us about the Nordic model, which is more social equality that is capitalistic, but more social equality. So the idea is we have to temper it with ethics, we have to temper it with public discourse and justice. The moral limits of the markets are difficult to determine, but they're very, very important.
Great. Okay, and down here.
I wanted to ask, there's this sudden rise of B schools and the production of specialists, how can we inculcate morals and ethics in our education system at primary school level and at university levels? How can they be part of the curriculum?
Great. All right. And?
What about the lady just there?
Yes, go ahead. Yes.
Lady right there.
Yes, sitting on the aisle. Yes.
Stand up, yeah.
I just wanted to mention that with what you've been talking about is the rise of the scientific temper and whatever.
Little louder.
Yeah, sure. If you have a look at what is written behind you on the Z poster, that is the Indian model of globalism that says Vasudeva Kutumbakam. That really means that the whole world is a family. And largely, I think what has happened is with all this scientific temper and rationalization and technocratization and the dehumanization that happened, we've all lost out on what is essentially the Indian tradition of thinking, which lays a lot of emphasis on intuitive thinking rather than rational thinking. And that is what I think essentially led us to develop, platforms like Vasudev Kutumbakam. Clearly, when we are talking about what you're saying, markets need regulation. And in a country like ours, that just doesn't happen. So I think we need to consider whether we could get back to something more on intuitive thinking for global happiness, what they call the gross domestic target of happiness rather than development.
Great. Okay, let's take a couple more, and then maybe we can. We have 10.
We have 10 minutes.
All right. All right. Well, let's take one more, and then maybe respond to this round. The woman in the front. Do you want to say something?
Well, we can both. There are a couple there that I wouldn't mind doing.
I'd like to know what you think of the future of cryptocurrencies, such as Bitcoin.
So, Bitcoin. Bitcoin. Do you have a position on Bitcoin, John?
Cryptocurrencies.
All right. All right. Now we'll respond to what's been said, and then we'll take a few more. Go ahead, John.
I think there are two things, if I could pick and choose, and then you can pick and choose. The reference back to Professor Sen and what the country can take. I mean, I know a fair amount about the agricultural system, a fair amount. I'm not an expert. And it's very interesting when you look here. The Western idea of industrialized agriculture was applied fairly freely in large areas and has led to, as I understand it, pretty much a disaster, with levels of suicide and poverty and so on. And that's because you're taking a mid-19th century Western concept, which is already out of time in the West, it doesn't work in the West, and you're applying it to small land holdings in India, where it had no chance of working. So there was no thinking through, is this appropriate to this place? And then you have one state, and I mentioned this somewhere else in the last couple of days, one state where they used the cooperative method, an Indian version of the cooperative method to work on the dairy industry, with the result that apparently it's working really well and they're exporting. So it's an example that we have real choices. You have real choices. And then the second comment that I would make is about the Indian tradition of thinking. I actually have gradually been creeping towards something, and it sort of comes out in a couple of books that I've written about Canada more than these other books. I actually think that it's time, and I'll make the extreme statement and then back off. It's time to blow up the university departments of philosophy. And I mean, blow up the structure of ideas, gather up the rubble, and bring in a whole bunch of other ideas and do it completely differently. So I think that, for example, in northern North America, you're from Minnesota, right? You said, yeah.
Originally, yeah.
There are all sorts of indigenous philosophies which are not romantic, which now appear to be postmodern. Why? Because they're not linear, they're not utilitarian, they're spatial, and they actually put human beings in the middle of the debate. as opposed to on top of the world. They're in the middle of the world. And I think that there are ideas in India, which I've read, which are extremely interesting. And so do you want to run everything with the American method? Do you want to run everything with the Indian method? If we're going to talk about internationalism as opposed to globalism, this is a very interesting moment to say Indian philosophy has something extremely important to offer to India, but actually it probably has something extremely interesting to offer to the United States and Canada. But in order to get there, you have to change totally the way we're teaching philosophy, economics in the West. That's one of the big steps, as well as raising the question of should universities in India be modeled on the Western university idea, to which I think the answer is no, they shouldn't be. And that's why you can't get at the Indian models of thinking, because they're too busy doing Immanuel Kant.
I see.
You know?
Okay.
That would be my...
All right. I would like to pick up on the question about how to incorporate ethical reflection and studies in the university system. I would say in a couple of ways. I think it's important to expose all students at the undergraduate level, whatever their specific subject, whether it's engineering or math or science or literature or history, to expose all students to moral and political philosophy, not as a field of expertise or specialty, but as a necessary preparation to be a democratic citizen and to be able to engage in public debate with having reflected critically on the moral and civic assumptions underlying the arguments we have in politics. And I think the kind of course to which students should be exposed is one where they not only read what famous philosophers of the past have written, but about ethics and about morality and about political arrangements, but a class where students are encouraged to interrogate and to question those philosophical texts and one another and their professor. So I think a kind of civic education in reasoned public argument and debate in the company of what philosophers of the past have written from various moral and cultural traditions. That's one suggestion. The other is, I think that new technology provides an opportunity to extend the scope and reach of those civic occasions in universities to expose students to the thinking of other students who may be engaged in similar studies half a world away. We did an experiment. Well, first we did an experiment putting my justice course, the Harvard course, online as a free, open course, just to see what would happen. And also to express in practice the idea, an idea that I believe strongly in, which is that higher education should be a public good, not a private privilege. So we made it available free, but that's not enough. I think that we should find a way to use new technology to enable there to be mutual learning across cultures and societies. And we did a small experiment with the help of a tech startup firm last year, where we created a live video link where students in 4 other countries connected with my students at Harvard for 3 of the justice classes, including a group of students in New Delhi, and also in Shanghai, in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and in Tokyo. So we had 5 countries. We could see one another on screens. We could hear one another. And together, we had a global public discussion about hard philosophical questions. We dealt with equality and inequality, with moral and civic obligation, and with the role of money in markets. And the technology will soon be available where it will be possible really to conceive and to implement on a widespread basis global classrooms, especially in these civic areas. And I think what the experiment showed, apart from the fact that the technology works, is that we have a lot to learn from one another, and that sometimes the differences within the groups of students, within the countries, are as vigorous and fierce as the disagreements across societies, which itself, I think, is an important discovery in this increasingly global civic age. Have we run out of time, or do we?
We can take one last question.
One last question.
There's a gentleman in the turban at the back. He already has a microphone.
All right, so the stakes are very high. Yours is the last question.
You have distinguished in small r.
You have to say it again. The microphone wasn't working.
Oh dear.
You have distinguished between reason
Louder.
with a capital R and small r. So my question is, reasoning with small r is good for like interpersonal communication, but how do you reason with institutions? For example, how do you reason even with a small r, government, with like
how do you reason if there is
with institutions?
With institutions.
With government, for example, with government, how do you reason with government? For example,
with the government.
Yes.
Okay, we're back to the how do you reason with?
Well, I mean,
government?
I think that, don't you think? I mean, it comes back to, you know, there's two ways of doing it. One of them is you have an elected Napoleon, you know, a celebrity whom we all love, so to speak, the presidential system at its most glorious. And there's a sort of, it doesn't really work because there's no real conversation, but he speaks for us or she. And the other is the messy thing of getting in as many people into as many rooms as possible and trying to work it up. So that's where it comes down to participation. I mean, participation in classrooms, participation in festivals, participation in political parties, debates in political parties, bothering your MP until she goes crazy, you know, writing to them endlessly, going to their offices and saying, you know, there's something wrong, what are you going to do about it? That kind of one-on-one group participation is a form of public reasoning, ethical engagement, memory, this is the way it should be done. No, I mean, it's very messy. If it's not messy, there's a problem. If it's neat and clean, you're in a very bad dictatorship.
Okay.
If you have truth, it's even worse.
Okay.
You know.
All right. Well, that makes me feel like we're in a pretty safe place here.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much.
Let's show our thanks to Michael Sandel and John Ralston Saul.